very much. Well, what I want to talk about today has to do with the images that we have of immigrants and some consistencies between images of immigrants past and immigrants present. And it's mostly a view of negative or hostile views towards immigrants that I want to look at. Because even though we're a nation of immigrants, and most of us look back with pride to our ancestors who came here looking for a better life, and we're, you know, the Statue of Liberty is an icon of American culture, and we're all familiar with the words on its base: "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." The U.S. public, nevertheless, hasn't always been always welcoming to immigrants, and the nature of hostility towards immigrants has been connected to the numbers that are coming over and the races of the people that are coming over. And that's what I wanted to look at a bit today. This is a graphic of the rate of immigration from 1821 through 2005, and you'll see it's fluctuated considerably over time. In the 1840s, we saw a big rise in immigration, largely due to the potato famines in Ireland that sent a lot of people to the United States looking for a way to survive. We had, as I'll talk about later, in the West Coast, there was, in the 1850s, an influx of Chinese, largely drawn to the West Coast as laborers for the Continental Railroad and for the agricultural work and mining. But by 1882, there was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, that actually banned further immigration from China. In the 1880s through 1920, we see massive immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, raising a lot of alarm. So by 1924, we have the Immigration Act of 1924 that limited severely immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe. In 1965, we have the Immigration and Nationality Act, which abolished national quotas, and we see again a rise in immigration, mainly from non-European areas this time, from Asia and from Latin America. So just to give you an overview of what the immigration patterns have looked like, we can really break down U.S. immigration into sort of three major periods. There was the period in the mid-19th century that came mainly from Northern Europe, and those were, the Irish were the biggest population there. But as I said, in the 1850s, we saw an influx of the Chinese on the West Coast. At the end of the 19th century, in the first decade of the 20th century, the immigrants came primarily from Eastern and Southern Europe. And they were mainly Italians, Jews, and Slavs who were fleeing both poverty and political oppression. And then in the last quarter of the 20th century, in the first decades of this century, we've seen that the largest number of immigrants have been either low-skilled Latin Americans or highly educated Asians. Okay, so that's sort of a view of the pattern. Here you get a graphic representation of the changing nature of the origin, the country of origin that the immigrants are coming from. So we see here from at the beginning of the 20th century, almost exclusively from Europe, European immigration declined significantly, and we see here the dark blue is Asia and the green is Latin America. We see an increase in those two populations in terms of who's coming to the United States. Now, when we look at current attitudes towards immigration, which are characterized by this editorial cartoon, you find that from a Pew study that 48% of white non-Hispanic Americans believe immigrants threaten traditional American culture and values. And 52% believe that immigrants are a burden because they're taking our jobs, housing, and health care. And that's what we see in this, this cartoon. It's that the fence cutting off immigration supposedly from Latin America with the Mexican border. We see people coming through, and free jobs, free health care. So that's a popular conception of immigrants today. Another group that we can look at are immigrants who are Muslim. 45% of non-Muslim Americans believe that Islam is more likely to encourage violence than other religions, and 39% in 2007 actually favored special identification cards for Muslims as a means to protect against terrorism. And we have here in this editorial cartoon, a very stark picture of the perceived threat. So rather than the torch of liberty, it's the bomb of the woman wearing hijab. So that perception that immigrants from that part of the world are terrorists is another sort of common theme that we see in American culture today. Now, when we go back and we look at historically what was happening, go back to the Irish immigration in the 1840s, we see that Americans have always been worried about immigrants and their impact on society. And this editorial cartoon from that era shows a poorhouse from Galway on a ship coming to the United States with the idea that the poor were streaming in, creating large problems for us. And as I said, these people were coming, they were rural peasants, they were fleeing starvation with potato blights, and rather than being welcomed, they were actively excluded from a lot of American life. Now today, in a contemporary cartoon, we see a very similar kind of image of a wave of immigration coming over. This time, we're looking at a Latino population, and they're identified as illegal immigrants. But a very similar sentiment about people coming here looking for employment. Now, in the 1850s, as I said, the immigration from China came to help build the railroads. In the 1880s through the 1920s, there were a large number of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. And they were looking for opportunities. Again, we had an expanding industrial economy, so there was a real pull to come into that. They came into our cities, and we see on this cover of Judge magazine, the American prosperity is the magnet attracting all of these different peoples from Southern and Eastern Europe. If we look closer, we can see that those images are all racial stereotypes of the threat represented by immigrants. We see Oriental disease and escaped convict and mafia and plague. We see the Dago criminal. We see foreign poverty and dirt. So one of the things that we need to recognize that is often forgotten today, or even not known by contemporary Americans, is that in that era, in the 19th century, all of these different nationality groups were perceived as being different races. And they were perceived as threatening to pollute the white race. And so even though today, when I talk to my students about, how many have Italian descent or how many have Irish descent, and I ask them whether they think of themselves as white or non-white, they're a little bit baffled by that. But the Irish and the Italians were not considered white by the majority of the population in the 19th century, and they were treated in many of the same ways that we see in terms of racism today. So if we look at the cover of Harper's Weekly, which was a major magazine, national magazine at the time, we can see this image of as two very dehumanizing stereotypes, one of a black man and another of an Irish man, both with facial features that suggest being ape-like. And they're on a scale, and it's balanced, with the message being very clear that the Irish were equivalent to blacks in that time period. And of course, this is a period when blacks were still slaves, and there was a struggle for freedom. So that's the image that we have to remember when we're looking back. Another editorial cartoon gives us the same vision of here too, stereotypes of Irish men are looking at apes, and it's the equivalence in terms of their facial features. We're getting a sense that they're really not really fully human.
Could you read what it says underneath the cartoon?
Yeah, I can try. It says a refutation of Darwinism, and I'm not very good at creating the dialect here. Tim, there's them that sees we was all of us that looky like that. The idea was that pretty appalling, but amazingly common if you look at the cartoons of that era. Now, the anti-immigrant anti-immigrant sentiment was especially harsh towards Asians. And as I told you before, in 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which actually suspended further immigration from China, and the Chinese who were here were treated to considerable hostility and violence, exclusion from a lot of parts of American life. And we see this editorial cartoon, Equal Rights of All Men, the cornerstone of our republic. And we see, again, very serious stereotypes here, not very flattering to the guy depicted as Irish, but he gets to stay on while the Chinese is kicked off. So that was really what was happening in terms of public sentiment about this. Today, when we look at immigration issues, we see cartoons that are reminding us that in 2010, Arizona passed SB 1070, which was a bill that increased police power to stop and question anyone they suspected of being an illegal immigrant, which actually made it very likely that they could stop anybody that they felt like, because they could say almost anybody from that part, anybody who's Latino from that part of the nation might be illegal. And so now we've seen a widespread adoption of those kinds of policies in other parts of the country as well. So, again, something of a parallel in terms of how we think about these things. Now, one thing, again, that we have to think about is that a lot of the distrust towards the Irish and the Italians had to do with hostility towards the Catholic Church. And this was a period of time when the Catholics were seen as being, a real threat to American culture, to have fundamentally different values, a danger to children, as well that the Catholic Church was seen as being a real threat, and there were burnings of churches and riots and such. Here we have one image from that era that shows a man protecting children, and coming out of the water, the image of what crocodiles that are actually bishops with their mitre caps on. Okay. And here we have an image, in the controversy over schooling, we have the image of, again, stereotyped Irish and a Catholic priest kicking the Holy Bible in the U.S. public schools. And so we see, real hostility, real threat that is often hard to remember. That was what was happening at the times when we, looking from today's perspective. Now today, the real perceived threat is with Muslims, and so our cartoons are not so much about Catholics, but about Muslims threatening us in various kinds of ways. And so here we see a cartoon raising the fear about Sharia law that is a form of hysteria through many areas in the country for not very valid reasons. This is the kind of images we have today, where Muslims have replaced Catholics as the religious group that's seen as threatening American cultural values and being fundamentally alien. Now, we're continuing looking at the threats from immigrants. One of the things that was going on was a fear that they were taking American jobs, and that they were doing it because they were cheap labor, and so they were threatening American workers. Here we see an image, an editorial cartoon, where the Chinese are represented with their swords that are labeled as cheap labor, and the American worker with the halo is about to be decapitated. So the problem here is seen as a threat to employment in the United States. When we look at a contemporary cartoon, we see something very similar. This cartoon shows a help wanted poster versus an identical wanted poster. Help wanted for cheap disposable labor with the picture of the Mexican immigrant, and big business is putting that up, but at the same time ICE is putting up the wanted poster for immediate deportation. So that tension between immigrant workers who are seen as stealing jobs, today it's Mexicans, in the past it was the Chinese or other groups. Now, over time, and this had a lot to do with public policy and a lot to do with public policy around the era of World War II, but eventually white Europeans gained admission to the white race and were assimilated, so that there wasn't a perception that they were the other, they were part of the white group. But blacks and Hispanics have retained their racial identity as non-whites and have not been allowed in to the American society in the same kind of way. Now, highly educated and affluent Asians who have come to the U.S. since the opening in 1965, and Asians born in the United States have retained their racial status, but they've been labeled as the model minority. And we see that Asians actually comprise the racial group with the highest rate of intermarriage with whites. And I suspect that that intermarriage, the high economic status, is part of a process of the whitening of Asians, so that they may indeed, with time, become white in the sense that the Italians and Slavs and Jews were once non-white and now they're considered white. I think that's probably what we see happening. But as racial outsiders, poor blacks and Hispanics have faced exclusion and alienation, largely concentrated in our urban ghettos. And again, public policy is largely responsible for this concentration of the creation of ghettos and the maintenance of ghettos in our society. And as a consequence, we see in 2009, 13% of whites lived in poverty, but 34% of Hispanics and 35% of blacks were poor. The wealth gap, following the Great Recession in 2008, but prior to that, the wealth gap between whites and blacks was that whites had on average 10 times the wealth of blacks. After the recession, that changed so that whites now have 20 times the wealth on average that black families do, which is very significant. Sociologists today now recognize that wealth is a more important indicator of life chances in the United States than is income, which we previously focused upon. But perhaps more important is the fact that blacks and Hispanics are more likely, 5 to 6 times more likely, to live in areas of concentrated poverty than are whites. Now that's really significant because concentrated poverty weakens community institutions, destroys the fabric of that local community in a way that exaggerates all of the problems of poverty. So that if you're poor but you live in an otherwise stable community with a lot of working and middle class people, you're suffering, but all of the institutional supports are still in place. But if you're poor and you're in a community where most of the other people are also poor, all of those community institutions are also weakened. And I understand a number of you have taught in the Allentown School District, so you have a sense of what that's like, that the concentration of poverty is really problematic. It also leads to a sense of alienation when the concentrated poverty group is separated as a distinct racial group. And so they can perceive the outside as excluding them on racial terms, and the outsiders can perceive them as being alien and responsible for their own circumstances. So these kinds of concentrated poverty and cultural alienation are highly associated with criminal activity, which is something we've seen across history. My research looking at the history of Eastern State Penitentiary, for instance, found that in each era, the group that had the highest rate of incarceration in the prison was the group that was at the bottom of the economic ladder. And each era, that was attributed to something that was intrinsic to the biology or culture of that group, and economic circumstances and cultural exclusion were largely ignored and overlooked. I think we see very similar things today. So if we look at who was perceived as the dangerous classes, in the first half of the 19th century, free blacks as well as immigrants were really the suspect classes. Those were the ones who were written about as being a challenge to deal with, high crime rates. Today, if we look at the dangerous classes that raise public alarm, and this horrific cartoon displays it, that Latinos and blacks are the target. And of course, the threat of terrorism from Muslims is very significant. So those are the groups that we see as dangerous to the United States and dangerous to our culture and safety in similar ways that we thought of earlier, somewhat different sets of groups being. Now, one way to control dangerous classes that we have practiced throughout U.S. history has been through drug laws. So if we look back in the 19th century, drug use was really common in the United States. Opium was a major ingredient in a lot of over-the-counter drugs that were used for a whole range of mild illnesses. It's been estimated that tens or hundreds of thousands of middle-class women were addicted to opium at the turn of the century because they were using those over-the-counter medicines. Cocaine was also an ingredient that was popular in over-the-counter drugs. And of course, the brilliant move, Coca-Cola was first marketed as a medicinal drink. It had cocaine in it, and it's what a great marketing plan to have your secret ingredient be addictive.
Is it in Diet Coke? I want to make sure it's still there.
So we had that. They eventually got rid of the cocaine in it, largely actually for racial reasons, that there was once African Americans began drinking Coca-Cola, because it became widely distributed, there was a fear that the Coca-Cola was creating, the cocaine in it was creating, violence, and particularly violence against white women, and so they changed the formula for that. Marijuana was a very common drug used as both a painkiller and a form of relaxation, and of course alcohol was a favorite drug for many groups in the United States. Now, each of these drugs, including alcohol, came under attack when they became associated with particular racial groups that were perceived as threatening the respectable classes. So the criminalization of drugs, which has always a lot of different motivations, allowed for the police to crack down on certain groups. So if you're using it, we're really focusing on you. That's just the way that we can arrest you and get rid of you. So smoking opium was a practice of the Chinese. And the anti-Chinese sentiment led to outlawing opium dens in 1875 and the Opium Exclusion Act of 1909, which outlawed the importation of opium for smoking. But interestingly, it was just the opium that was used for smoking and not the kind of opium that was used in the medications that all of the middle-class women were addicted to. So very selective enforcement of that. In 1900, the press started to associate cocaine use among blacks with violence and sexual assault, something I was alluding to a little bit earlier. In 1914, the Harrison Narcotics Act was outlawed, largely to outlaw the importation and distribution of opiates. When we get to the 1980s, sort of our time frame, we can see that cocaine made headlines again because the powder cocaine that was associated with the affluent, with celebrities in Hollywood or Wall Street, high rollers, usually led not to criminalization but to treatment and rehab units and such. But the introduction of crack cocaine, which is chemically identical to powder cocaine, was seen as a drastic threat to our society because it was largely used by low-income blacks in the inner city. Now, I don't want to minimize the threat because it did devastate many communities, but if we look at the difference in legal penalty, this quotation from the New York Times captures that. The original law was grossly unjust. It mandated a minimum of 10-year sentence for anyone caught with 50 grams of crack, about the weight of a candy bar. To get a comparable sentence, a person arrested for powdered cocaine would have to be caught with 5,000 grams, enough to fill a briefcase. Okay. So we got, continuing till today, that same sense of who we're really targeting when we're looking at drug stuff has to be these groups that are considered dangerous rather than the danger to the whole population from the drug use. Now, the temperance movement, which led to prohibition, was largely a movement supported by rural Protestant women who were fearful about the Catholics that were coming into the cities. And because they were seen as a threat, and the use of alcohol was associated with the reason why they were poor, the reason why they were suffering as they did. And so we had the 18th Amendment, which banned the sale and manufacture and transportation of alcohol until 1920 when it was, until 1933 when it was repealed. Now, the use of marijuana by Mexicans prompted public concern about the dangers of the drug, especially as tensions grew over labor relations on the border, competition from Mexican workers. And so we had in 1934 the Uniform State Narcotics Drug Act, which was successful in getting passed largely because of a campaign against marijuana use. as very marijuana was portrayed as making people commit homicide, making them crazy. It was, a very different image of what that was portrayed of what marijuana could do. And so this was largely a way in which the Latino population along the border could be targeted, and later the black population in cities. Today, our fear of the Mexican drug trade, and we see another recent cartoon, is really the source of a lot of animosity towards Mexican immigrants, whether they're here legally or illegally. And, and that's a significant part. We can see in this cartoon here depicting shooting up, both shooting up the drugs and shooting each other in the drug war. This concern that what's crossing our border isn't just immigrants, but crime and violence and drugs as well. Leaving out the part that most of the weapons for that drug war come from the United States. So the criminalization of drugs today has really helped fill our prisons. And approximately a quarter of the people held in U.S. prisons or jails are there for drug offenses. And we incarcerate in the United States more people for drug offenses than any other country in the world. Of course, we have the highest rate of incarceration of any country in the world, which is somewhat troubling given our perception of ourselves as this free, liberal society, particularly when we look at who we're locking up and the vastly disproportionate number of people of color in prison. But the war on drugs had a lot to do with that. And the rising prison population has a lot to do with our policies about drugs, so that a disproportionate number of blacks and Hispanics end up behind bars. Now, another response to the perceived threat from immigrants has been the tightening of our border between the U.S. and Mexico. And when we look at U.S. Border Patrol agents, the number has risen from fewer than 3,000 to more than 20,700 in 2011. We've installed 700 miles of fencing along with surveillance cameras and drones. And in 2010, Congress approved an additional $600 million for border defenses on top of the $17 billion in the annual budget. Right? Now, the current discussions, just this last week, about immigration reform, the prerequisite for any action in both the president's and the congressional bipartisan bill is tightening border security. So that border security is seen as being, where we're focusing our attention before we can think about immigrants from that part of the world. Now, despite all these efforts at trying to secure the border, research has shown that between 90 and 98% of Mexican nationals who have tried to reach the U.S. illegally have succeeded in doing so. Now, it means that they've had to rely more on coyotes, who are the hired smugglers, and the fees for those smugglers have doubled in the last 15, 20 years. Even though they're undeterred by the border patrols and the fences, what happens is that they're pushed into more dangerous areas, and so where they're physically at risk from the threat of the desert or the mountains, and where they're also at risk of getting shot by the border guards. Now, the research indicates that it's economic factors that drives crossing the border rather than other kinds of concerns. And so the number of illegal immigrants in the United States is actually, well, the numbers stayed largely the same because of border security, interestingly enough. It used to be that people who came here without documentation would move back and forth across the border, but because the border tightened and it became expensive and dangerous, more of them are staying here longer, an unintended consequence of that policy. But the decline in people trying to cross the border has not been connected to the additional security, but to our worsening economic circumstances. So the jobs aren't here, and that's affected their immigration policies. Now, how true are public perceptions about this? I mean, if we are correct that immigrants, particularly undocumented immigrants, are creating all these problems, then maybe we're justified in these feelings. But the research indicates that immigrants aren't hurting job opportunities or wages for the United States. And one of the things that we have to think about is that immigrants don't just take jobs, they also increase the overall demand in the marketplace. You know, they're renting homes, they're buying food, they're, you know, buying cars, they're using all of the stuff in the economy, so they're contributing in that way. It's also true that immigrants are more likely than native residents to start their own businesses, which is something that we hear a lot of talk about as an economic engine for the United States. Now, many people say, well, undocumented immigrants don't pay taxes, but that's actually not completely correct. In addition to the sales tax that everybody pays, or the local taxes paid through, built into the rent that people are paying. In 2007, the Social Security Trust Fund received between $120 and $240 billion from illegal immigrants, which represented between 5 and 10% of the total assets. So they're helping to support our retirement. 62% of the income tax, 62% of undocumented workers had income tax withheld, even though they could never file for any kind of return. Only 10% of illegal immigrants had children that they were sending to the public schools, and about 5% received food stamps, welfare, or unemployment. So they're actually using the resources at a lower rate, but contributing at a significant rate in the U.S. economy. If we look at the issue of crime and drugs, we find that immigrants in general are less likely to engage in crime than those born in the United States. And if we look at drug use, despite higher arrest and incarceration rates, Hispanics actually are less likely to be involved in drugs than whites, you know, to a small extent. So there's reason to question a lot of the perceptions that lie behind the fears of immigrants. And even though people have identified lots of reasons to oppose immigration and the hostility towards both Mexicans and Muslims, it really doesn't stand up to the evidence to the extent that many of the spokespeople are indicating. And so we really need to look at hostility towards immigrant groups today, I think, in the context of how immigrant groups in the past were perceived, and see that racial prejudice, more than legitimate fears about how they'll devastate our society, are probably at the root of those feelings. So, thank you. I'd be happy to take questions or to facilitate discussion.
I guess I have a question,
Yeah.
just on the economic sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Businesses used undocumented workers, okay, and don't know and everything and all, the competition and everything and all. Okay, the fact that businesses, when it became known or more known, or maybe people started getting upset that they were using immigrants or non-documented workers and everything and all, would that be an increase or reason why more work was sent like overseas then? Because then it would be, I'm trying to say, like, you don't have it here, we'll have it there, and we're still making money and everything?
I don't know that immigrant use or people getting upset about cheap labor of immigrants led to the globalization and outsourcing of jobs. Other kinds of factors did that. Often American workers are blamed for it because they price themselves out of the marketplace. That's a really stilted way of looking at the issue. It's pretty much as soon as the technology was available, through both communications technology that allowed instant communication to other parts of the world, and the sending of instructions for computer to computer for tooling plants and such, and transportation technology such as containerized shipping made it affordable to do this. The lure of having low-cost workers in other parts of the world, very low-cost workers, people who are working for pennies an hour rather than dollars an hour, made it economically viable for people to send their work overseas. Now, one of the things we have to think about is that trade policies facilitated this, and facilitated the interests of business in the sense that companies have, through our free trade agreements, can move their materials across borders. They can move back and forth without any kinds of penalties or tariffs. But workers, right, cannot move across borders in that same kind of way. And so our policies allow us to send our jobs overseas to take advantage of low-income wages, but not to allow workers to follow where the better jobs are. And so That's one of the things that some critics of our policy have focused on. It is true that cheap labor, that can be exploited, particularly undocumented workers, can lower the wages in terms of competition with other workers. But when we look at in some industries like construction, we can see that happening. But in a lot of other industries, the undocumented worker are doing jobs that U.S. workers wouldn't do. If we had policies that protected the rights of those workers, or we allowed them to enter the country as legal entrants, then the issues for workers would be lessened because they wouldn't be competing at lower wages illegally, and they would be contributing to the economy. So it's a complex issue, but it's often not played out in its complexity in discussions about it. Yeah.
How long? The Irish and the Germans and all the European immigrants and even the Chinese, those perceptions have changed.
Yes.
But how long did it take for them to change?
Well, really, the crucial factor was World War II and the policies that the government put in place around World War II. Part of it had to do with ideological changes because we were fighting against Nazi Germany that had an explicitly eugenic, racist vision, and so the eugenics movement in the United States became somewhat discredited, and notions of racial purity became discredited as something to talk about publicly. But a lot of sociologists credit the programs when veterans were returning from World War II that led to the suburbanization of the United States and that allowed people of any anybody in the white race to buy homes, that integration in those communities really, and the rising tide of economic opportunity had a lot to do with it. Now another factor, and this is where those European immigrants differ from today's Latino immigrants, that because immigration was cut off or significantly decreased from Southern and Eastern Europe, where the groups that were seen as being threatening were coming from, at the turn of the century, and then the war, World War I and such, cut off immigration. Those groups didn't have ready access to fresh members that were feeding their community, with revitalizing the culture, with maintaining an ethnic community that had high visibility. And so the integration of second and third generation people into mainstream America was easier, and there was no longer this pool of recent immigrants who were attracting attention and maintaining that culture. In the circumstances with Latino populations today, there's lots of interplay between the countries of origin and the United States, and a lot of new immigrants currently coming in. So even when some members in the second or third or fourth generation settle in other neighborhoods and integrate in, there's still this perception that there's this community of people who are resilient to assimilation in our country. And I think that creates a significant problem for public perception of who wants to join American society and who doesn't.
My grandparents were immigrants. They came in the late 1800s.
Okay.
Probably around 1895.
Okay.
So that makes me second generation American on that side.
Is
that how my grandparents?
They were your grandparents, so yeah, you would be second generation. So where did they come from?
They came from Heilbronn, Germany. And I think they came from Castle Garden or something like that, rather than Ellis Island.
Okay.
I don't think Ellis Island was built at that time.
Okay, I don't know about that.
They came from Germany.
Yeah, okay. Another thing that we should think about when we're thinking about immigration, a lot of people who are quite critical of undocumented workers today, or immigrants today, argue, well, my parents or grandparents or great-grandparents came here, they were all legal. Well, we really didn't have restrictions on immigration until those immigration acts in the 1880s and 1924. And so there were pretty lax standards for getting in. Pretty much anyone who wanted to come here. There were, tests, but pretty much if someone could memorize a line of English, they could pass the test to get in. And they were faced with pretty, horrible bigotry and required to try to Americanize in really weird ways. Henry Ford was very influential in this movement. He had a project so that he hired immigrants, but he also had what he called the sociology department, which would go out and inspect whether the immigrants that he hired were living appropriately American lives in terms of their hygiene and who lived in their homes and how they dressed and were they learning English and all of these kinds of things, or they wouldn't stay on the payroll. So there was a significant push for immigrants to assimilate. I think I lost my original point. Oh, I know what. But when we look at undocumented workers today, one of the things to think about is that most of the undocumented workers that are coming from Latin America, at least, are very low skill. And we have a minuscule opening for legal immigration for low-skilled workers, even though we use a huge number of them in our economy. And if you've ever listened to growers talking about what happens when we tighten, where they can't get people to pick their crops, that's what happens when we don't have any legal mechanism for people to come in. So there's also not an equivalent when we look at how the rules when people entered at different times. And so that's something that I think we need to think about when we're thinking about immigration policy, which we're all going to be doing in the next, it's a big deal now, so we're all going to be thinking about that.
How much, and you alluded to it, does English play a part, or language play a part in this whole scheme? Because it seems to me that years ago, they kept their family language or whatever, but they also learned English.
Yeah.
That doesn't seem to be the case in the present.
There seem to be a couple of things going on with that. One is that even immigrants from, our grandparents' generation, often the people who came here as adults had a very hard time learning English, and they often lived in enclaves where it wasn't really necessary for them to learn English, or learn only halting English. And so it was the next generations that were likely to learn English, particularly, as I said, when those communities weren't revitalized by new people coming in and assimilation was more possible to move into mixed communities. That's two things going on here is that our perception that Latinos don't learn English, and I think that in this area that's the dominant perception, or refuse to learn English, is partly because a lot of the people that we see in the community are relatively recent immigrants and so they came here like previous generations of immigrants and have a struggle to learn English. And I have to say, as someone who teaches alongside colleagues who do English as a second language, that there's always a huge waiting list for people to take those courses. And so to conceptualize it as people don't want to learn English might be, sort of misreading the situation. But it's also true that if people have grown up in a community where maybe Spanish is still the dominant language because there are so many people in that segregated community that are speaking that language, then it's harder to learn standard English if you're learning it essentially as a second language. Even if you're fluent in conversational English as someone born in the United States but living in that kind of community, you don't necessarily develop the kinds of skills with the language that can help you succeed in school. And so we see a lot of problems associated with living in those kinds of communities. I think Spanish also has a different sort of history as well. The huge part of our southwestern continental United States was originally Spanish, in that we took it by conquest from Mexico. And the people in the Southwest like to say they didn't cross the border, but the border crossed them. And so that history of having that we were here first and this was our language, is significant. And then when we think of the fact that Puerto Rico, which is a Spanish-speaking territory, is part of the United States, and a lot of people have a lot of pride in their English language in their Spanish language, and even if they recognize the need to be bilingual, they don't necessarily want to give up their Spanish heritage. And so that's a little bit different. It's more in line with what we see in Canada with the French than what we see, because the French settled there first, and more than what we see with other groups that came here specifically to try to assimilate to American society. So I don't know if that helps you think about that issue. Anybody else? Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.